I'll double check. Yes, it's not muted. So, all right. Alrighty, so week 5 review. I definitely can't guarantee a short one on this one because chapter 15 is a little bit rough. So, but we want to cover it. So, we're going to go over 11, 12, and 15 today, and then do some questions for each. Just 2 or 3 for each one. So I'll try to keep it down a little bit. But chapter 11 was our and it was our microbial control chapter. So like controlling microbes on surfaces, whether that's living surfaces or non-living surfaces. So this one is a major like one where we have a lot of terms going on with it. And so basically like knowing your terms. Doesn't just switch. So why would it? Knowing our terms and this is annoying. Okay, there we go. Knowing our terms and the differences between them. So again, there's a lot of that in this chapter. So we want to, this is really annoying me. Okay. No. This, I feel like I haven't had this much trouble with this before. It's like, I don't know if it got an update or what, but. Okay, so asepsis versus disinfection versus decontamination versus sterilization. All right. Asepsis is on living surfaces. So skin, if you're prepping your patient's arm with an alcohol pad, that's asepsis. Also known as antisepsis. Those are interchangeable terms. And an antiseptic falls into that category, okay? All right, disinfection is for non-living surfaces. All right, neither of these removes all microbes. Both of them, we're just focused on removing most microbes versus sterilization, where you are removing all signs of life. This will be viruses, which you may or may not consider alive, but it will at least like deactivate the viruses. So it includes viruses, endospores, bacteria, prions, everything would be covered with that one. All right, decontamination, it's very similar to disinfection, but it's slightly different. Whereas disinfection is just removing things from non-living surfaces, decontamination is the mechanical removal of microbes. Usually this refers, so it's mechanical. And so I want to define what that means by that. Mechanical is like physical removal. So whenever you are scrubbing to prep for like a surgery or something, you are mechanically removing the microbes by the scrubbing, and the suds help physically remove the microbes from the surface of the skin. So that is a living surface, but decontamination, if it's using mechanical means to remove something, then it is decontamination. Whether it's a living or non-living surface doesn't matter, but if it's a mechanical physical removal. Another more obvious example of decontamination will be filtration. So you're physically removing the microbes from media or from a liquid or something like that, or from the air. So that's decontamination. Decontamination is physical removal of the microbes. Disinfection, like we use with our disinfectant in our lab, that this is going to be just removal of the microbes, most of them. That could include decontamination too, but it's just a more general term. It could be chemical killing, it could be inhibiting growth, it could be physical removal, anything that gets rid of most of the microbes. So knowing the difference between those is going to be important for Unit 3, especially for Chapter 11. We've learned about static and cidal, so I'm not going to go over that too much, but if you know that something kills the microbes and you know it for a fact, then it's cidal. If you know for a fact that it's not killing them and it's just inhibiting, then it is static. Okay. Then one of the methods that we can use to control microbes is by denaturing either their DNA or their protein, and more commonly proteins, because the microbes are going to rely on the proteins for all of their metabolic processes for building and breaking down things. So if you can denature proteins, you can usually control microbes. The native state of a protein or DNA, either way, the native state is its functional state, where it normally functions at, and we can disrupt that using heat and pH and other chemicals. If you're using heat, you can measure the effectiveness of something based on how long it takes to kill it or based on the temperature that it takes to kill it. So thermal death time is the time that it takes to kill all microbes or a specific microbe, depending on what you're testing. The time that it takes to kill the microbe at a specified temperature. So the thermal death time. So if you are treating something at boiling temperature, which would be 100 degrees Celsius or 212 Fahrenheit, how much time do you have to boil it to kill E. coli or kill Giardia or whatever? So that would be the thermal death time. The thermal death point is the temperature that you would have to be at to kill the organism within 10 minutes. So if you want to know, I can boil this at 100 degrees, Celsius or whatever, but I only have 10 minutes to sterilize it, is, then what you would say is, what temperature do I have to put this at to get rid of this in 10 minutes? And that would be the thermal death point. What temperature do I have to put this at to kill this organism within 10 minutes? And so whatever that temperature is would be the thermal death point. And so these are just measures of what temperature or how long you have to treat something for in order to achieve killing your target organism. We basically broke down all of our methods as being physical, chemical, or mechanical in nature. So physical methods will include things like boiling and filtering and things like that, whereas chemical, we're literally using a specific chemical, and we had to look at how each chemical would work. So this is important to remember that if sterilization is your goal and you're trying to remove all organisms, including endospores, boiling does not achieve sterilization, not just by itself. So boiling something for 30 minutes will disinfect, and it's quite effective at disinfection, but it won't remove endospores, things like Clostridium or Bacillus, right? So those will survive boiling. We can combine boiling and cooling and do a specific, time frame of, if you boil something for 30 minutes, let it cool down to room temperature for an hour and a half to 2 hours, and then boil it again, and then repeat that cycle, very, specific time intervals, then you can achieve sterilization, because you would allow the endospores to come out of the endospore state, become vegetative, and then kill off all those new vegetative guys and keep cycling that. That process is called tyndallization. And it's not commonly used because you have to know about like the biology of the spores and things like that. But it can potentially achieve sterilization. One that's more commonly used is something like pasteurization, which does not sterilize. Does not sterilize. Pasteurization doesn't sterilize, but it still uses a similar principle. Now, you're not heating it up to boiling. You're heating it up to warm temperature. So we're talking like 60 degrees Celsius. So heat it up for 30 seconds to a few minutes at elevated temperature that's under boiling. So you're still maintaining the integrity of the milk, for example, which is commonly pasteurized, right? You're still maintaining the integrity of all the proteins in the milk, but that cycling of hot and cool will help eliminate most pathogens. Not all of them, but most of them. And we know this because if you buy pasteurized milk, does it go bad in the fridge? Of course it does. Even if you don't open it, it'll eventually go bad, right? So you haven't eliminated all the microbes. They're still in there. If something is sterile, once it's actually sterile, and then you seal it off so nothing else can get in there, it can stay indefinitely sterile. And so the fact that milk goes bad is because there's microbes in there, right? So we know pasteurization doesn't completely get rid of everything. Ultra pasteurization is like taking it to the next level, using slightly hotter temperatures or doing the cycles more or extending the hot temperature cycles. So you can buy milk. One thing that people brought up to me one time in my class was they're like, why does Brahms milk taste so much better than like Highland or, Walmart brand milk or whatever. It's because it's ultra pasteurized. And so it has more microbes removed. It tastes cleaner. You can taste the cleanliness of it. It also lasts much longer on the shelf. So all lactose-free milks are ultra pasteurized. And that's why things like lactate and stuff, it's still milk. It's just been treated to remove lactose from it, but they also ultra pasteurize it in that process. And so lactose-free milks, if you guys don't know, if you don't drink a lot of milk, I hate milk. I hate it. But I'll have milk on like a cereal now and then, right? But it's just me and my husband. We don't drink a lot of milk. And so lactose-free milks, even if you're not lactose intolerant, lactose-free milks and ultra pasteurized milks, those are going to last, they last forever in the fridge, you guys. Like I'm talking months. So buy ultra pasteurized. I highly recommend it. It's going to have less microbes in it and it just lasts way longer. So anyways, there's that. So pasteurization and boiling, they don't sterilize, but they do remove quite a bit of the pathogens. Boiling's more effective than pasteurization at disinfecting. Next, we have incineration. Incineration is pretty straightforward. You're burning something to ash. You're literally oxidizing the chemical components in a cell to the point where it's like obliterated, basically. So incineration is very effective. We're talking temperatures of like, you know, very, very high, thousands of degrees Celsius, and that's going to be more effective versus filtration, where we're mechanically removing microbes using an actual filter. But if you combine moisture with heat, which is what we see with an autoclave, moisture plus heat, the moisture helps to denature the proteins. So that water being there and water being very polar, it wants to interact with other molecules. So as you're adding heat with that, the water wants to act more with the other molecules and it interferes with the protein stability. So adding moisture with your heat makes the heat way more effective. If you add moisture and pressure, which helps you achieve the heat that's above boiling. So that's what we get with an autoclave. We're adding pressure, moisture, and heat. So we can get the temperature above boiling. We can get it up to 121 degrees Celsius instead of just 100 by adding the pressure in. And we have a heat there and we have steam in there, which is that moisture that helps destabilize the proteins. So now you can autoclave something for 20 minutes as opposed to at 121 degrees Celsius, as opposed to having to bake it in an oven for 6 hours, you know, at dry heat. So moist heat is much more effective than dry heat, but sometimes you can't expose things to moisture. And so it just depends on what things you're trying to decontaminate, disinfect, or sterilize. And do you need it to be sterile, or is it okay to just have it disinfected? All right, so that's the basic rundown of our ideas behind our physical and mechanical guys. I do have them listed out here with our, oh, I didn't talk about radiation. So radiation, ionizing radiation versus non-ionizing radiation. So in ionizing radiation, what we're having is basically energized particles that are moving in a wave pattern that if you're ionizing, when those particles hit other particles, it causes them to ionize. And so if we remember from our chemistry stuff, ionic bonds is where you transfer an electron to another thing, like it's completely getting transferred over, right? So in ionizing radiation, we're removing an electron. Like that's what's happening there. It's like we're causing electrons to fly off. And so it's such high energy molecules causing literal physical removal of electrons, then resulting in ions as a result. So radiation that has energy that causes those molecules in your body or in a microbe or whatever to literally shoot off electrons and become ionized. Now, it's extremely dangerous to living tissues, but it's extremely effective because it can pass through surfaces. So yeah, is it ionizing, you know, potentially the molecules that would be in the paper or whatever that you have the thing wrapped in? Yeah, potentially, but who cares if it's non-living? We don't really mind that so much. And it doesn't continue to cause damage once that has gone through. So whenever you guys get syringes out or like those little like vacutainer holders, right? Like we do with like blood draws, those little plastic things, and you get it out of like the plastic container with the paper on the back, that was sterilized through ionized radiation. In fact, more commonly, disposable items like that are going to have been sterilized through ionizing radiation because the plastics there would melt if we exposed them to the heat needed to sterilize them. So we can just ionize radiation with it. Super cheap, super effective, and they stay sterile for a very, very long time. So things like that are pretty useful. We call this cold sterilization because there's no heat involved in it. Then we have non-ionizing radiation. This would be like UV radiation. Can you potentially achieve sterilization with UV radiation? If you have UV light exposed long enough to something, you can potentially achieve sterilization of a surface, but it's not commonly used for sterilizing because we just usually aren't exposing something to enough UV radiation for a long enough period of time to sterilize. But we do very commonly use it for disinfecting. And so it's only effective for surfaces. And the way that non-ionizing radiation works, it's a similar process, but it's not as energetic of waves. So instead of shooting off electrons, you can cause bonds in the DNA to bond next to each other instead of across from the A or the T or the C. Instead of across, they're bonding next to each other. And this happens most commonly with the Ts, the thymines. So Ts next to each other will bind together, causing thymine dimers. This is why you get cancer developing from UV radiation. So we have repair mechanisms in our cells that repair that damage, but if it doesn't keep up with that, or if you get too much UV exposure, then potentially your Ts will bind next to each other, and then that causes issues with your genetics whenever you're trying to copy the cells and make new ones. And then that can potentially lead to skin cancers like that. With people who have certain genetic abnormalities that we say they're allergic to the sun or whatever, and I forget what the name of the disorder is, but they literally don't have the repair mechanisms in place for the non-ionizing radiation, like UV radiation. They don't have any repair mechanisms in place, so they can't be in the sun. Otherwise, within 10 years, they'll have severe melanoma. And their lifespans are usually decreased by 30 years on average, just because of you can't control all UV radiation at all times and that sort of stuff. So having that in place is more commonly used by your body than we realize, honestly. But non-ionizing radiation, we often do that. I think of like our biosafety cabinet, which you guys don't ever use here. But if we were working with pathogenic level microbes, we would use them in this cabinet over here. And it creates airflow to keep the microbes in there. But after we use it, we put a UV light on in there, and that just helps sterilize the surface because we can just leave that on for hours and we can sterilize the surface, but it's not going to penetrate anything. So really is only effective for surfaces, whereas ionizing radiation can penetrate things. So that's it pretty much for our physical methods. For our chemical methods, definitely be able to organize things based on what group they fall in. Our major groups for our chemicals are our halogens. This is literally our halogens on the periodic table of elements. So this will be fluorine, chlorine, iodine, and bromine. Bromine, we don't see it a lot like in everyday practices, but like hot tubs more commonly use bromine than they do chlorine because it evaporates less slowly or less quickly. Evaporates more slowly. So hot tubs, because they're heated up, will often use bromine instead of chlorine, but it's a similar concept on how it works. We know chlorine is commonly used in water just all the time for keeping it clean, whether it's in swimming pools or even for treating tap water. While you might not have chlorine actively still in there, we have used chlorine gas at some point in treating it to remove any microbes that were in there. So it's pretty commonly used halogen. Using household bleach, you're using hypochlorous acid. And so that is something that can be used for cleaning services as well. So sodium hypochlorite is what it really makes. And then hypochlorous acid can be a product of it reacting with other molecules. So, and even your neutrophils make hypochlorous acid to help, keep control of microbes and digest them and things like that. So pretty useful stuff there. And fluoride in your toothpaste and all that stuff. Fluorine is actually one of those ones that is more electronegative than even oxygen is. One of the few molecules, atoms, you could say, that's more electronegative than oxygen. But that works to our advantage when we're putting it in with microbes to help damage microbes that way. All right, so that's the halogens. They can sterilize when you use them at high enough concentrations and when you use them properly according to directions. Just depends on a lot of these guys, especially the chemicals, depend very heavily on how you're using them in the application as to whether or not they can sterilize, but definitely know which ones can potentially sterilize. And if I outline it in here somewhere, like you need a concentration of this much to sterilize, then know that, okay? So that I feel like this is, honestly, this is why I say chapter 11 and chapter 12 are flashcard chapters because they do really work really well with flashcard type practice. All right, the phenols. Phenol is carbolic acid. We learned about phenol because we learned about how Lister would, basically disinfect his operating theaters. He was one of the first people who actually used a disinfectant in a surgical theater. So that was carbolic acid that he used, which is phenol. It's the same thing. And it's a pretty damaging chemical and it's pretty dangerous to work around. So we don't use phenol straight up by itself that much, maybe in like kennel cleaning situations in veterinary settings. In hospital settings, we usually use phenol derivatives, which we call phenolics, which are just different versions of that phenol. This would include triclosan and chlorhexidine. And if you don't know, you will know because you'll be very familiar with it. But in hospital settings, chlorhexidine is very commonly used, whether it's in skin preps or in scrub preparations. So surgical scrubs have chlorhexidine in that soap. So it's a combination of chlorhexidine with its phenolic compound, as well as like the mechanical removal with the suds and the detergents and stuff like that. All right, alcohols. Alcohol, we kind of went over. This is kind of why I brought this up today with our ethanol today. But alcohols, because they have sort of an amphipathic nature, they can disrupt cell walls. More commonly, it's going to be cell walls, but in the correct concentrations and in the correct use, they can disrupt cell walls, cell membranes, and even coagulate proteins if you have the right amount of water in it. So it's very important to remember with alcohols, 70% is most effective because that 30% water there helps with coagulating the proteins and leads to a little bit of protein denaturation, proteins not being able to function properly and stuff like that. So if you are out of Walgreens and you're trying to figure out what alcohol would be best for, disinfection purposes, whether it's skin or surfaces or whatever, 70% works better than the higher percentages because you want that water in there. It actually works better. If we're talking about the difference between isopropyl alcohol versus ethyl alcohol, isopropyl alcohol is more effective. Ethyl alcohol is better for your skin. So isopropyl alcohol will dry out your skin more over time, which is why during COVID, we saw a huge shift in most of our hand sanitizers from isopropyl alcohol to ethyl alcohol because people were using it so much that they started having their skin dry out on their hands. And so if you have cracked open skin, then that's going to make you more susceptible to disease. And so they switched to ethyl alcohol, even though it's more expensive and less effective. It's not considerably so. So isopropyl alcohol is cheaper, it's more effective. If you're not using it all the time, then that can be a better choice as far as effectiveness goes. But ethyl alcohol is just fine, and it's better for your skin. And of course, yes, question.
You use like the 90% if the 70% is better.
I think it's more of a gimmick, and I think it's also more for like mixing with other things. So if you're using like 90% or higher, you can mix it with other things to create tinctures. So if you wanted to mix it with like, vinegar, or if you wanted to mix it with essential oils or something, then you're going to be watering it down some with those things. And so then you could still maintain the 70 after you've watered it down, you know what I mean? So it's more for mixture applications, but if you're using it straight up as a disinfectant, then 70 is what you want to reach for there. Just make me want to like use heat sanitizers, so I'm gonna start talking about this stuff. I can't actually brush my teeth when I start talking about the brushing the teeth chapters, but I can use hand sanitizer. Okay. Anyways.
I think it just muted it.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, the notification came on.
Oh, yeah, I bet because I walked up there. So that microphone is trying to pick me up. Let me make sure that this is on. Yes, this one's still good. So I think because I walked up there, that computer was trying to pick me up. All right, let me put this back. All right, we're good. All right, oxidizing agents. They are what they sound like. Redox reactions, once again, surfacing their ugly little heads around us. Redox reactions, remember, gain electron reduced, lose electron oxidized. So oxidizing agents cause things to lose electrons. They cause them to be oxidized. And so the way that these work, usually they are oxygen based as well, because oxygen is so electronegative, it'll be removing the electrons from things and stealing it from things. Common oxidizing agent that is used to clean things will be hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, hydrogen peroxide. You have a hydrogen per oxygen, okay, H2O2. So these are often more commonly effective against anaerobic bacteria. If you have a surface scrape, then I do not recommend using hydrogen peroxide. If it's a mostly superficial wound, if it's not super, super deep, then you don't want to use hydrogen peroxide because with enough hydrogen peroxide, you're actually going to be damaging your own cells and then you're just feeding the microbes in those areas after having dead tissue around. If you have super deep wounds and we're concerned about Clostridium infections like Clostridium perfringens that causes gas gangrene, which is common in the environment, even part of your biome, Then we might rinse out deep wounds with hydrogen peroxide, but that's just to get oxygen in there. But the superficial aspect of like most wounds that you're going to see, we won't reach for hydrogen peroxide on. Hydrogen peroxide can sterilize if you have a concentration of 35% or higher. So if you buy hydrogen peroxide at the store, we're talking 3%. Potentially you could get sick up like as low as 6% could sterilize, but 3% that you buy at the store, never going to sterilize with it, never going to sterilize. When we do sterilize with hydrogen peroxide, we usually use it at 35% hydrogen peroxide, and then use it in like a what we call a chemiclave situation, or like a box where we'll like vaporize the hydrogen peroxide, and then we can expose all the things in the box to that vapor, and anything the vapor touches, we would consider sterilized at that point. So you can use hydrogen peroxide for sterilization. It's not commonly used in like everyday practices. It'll be something that if you can't autoclave something, or it's not practical to use radiation on it, then you could potentially use hydrogen peroxide at concentrations that are much, much higher than usual. But 3% won't sterilize. Surfactants. These are things that mimic basically what we think of with our lipid bilayer. You have your phosphate head that has that negative charge to it, and then you have your hydrophobic tails coming off of it, right? So this is your phospholipids that make up your membranes. And so surfactants and detergents basically mimic that. And they're usually used for mechanical, but they do disrupt membranes as well. And so what they do is, because they mimic that, they might have another polar head. In fact, they often usually have heads that are positively charged, and then they might have their own little tails. And so chemically, the negative heads actually like the look of that positive charge, and so they'll be more likely to interact with it than they would others. Now, are they going to be likely, the negative heads will prefer to interact with the positive heads because that's just more appealing to them. Then they'd be next likely to interact with other charged, like negative heads, versus that hydrophobic tail, which they absolutely do not want to interact with. So that's how you would rank like kind of the priority of that. But we'll use this positive charged head. And the way we achieve that positive is by using something that is alkaline and has like a positive, product that it has on that end. It's usually based on ammonia, which is NH4 positive. So it's just an N with 4 H's around it. It's usually based on this molecular structure here. And so this is ammonia. And then if you change one of these H's to some other thing, it could be a long tail in our group. It could be long tails or whatever. So this is our charged head with that ammonia end. And then we have the tails coming off of it. And this whole structure here, this whole structure here, where we have this positive charged head and that hydrophobic. You see how it mimics that phospholipid, but with a positive charge in there. So this is what we call a quaternary ammonia compound, or quats. And so these are very commonly used in disinfectant. In fact, our disinfectant in our lab is almost assuredly a quaternary ammonia compound. Most often than not, most cleaning agents are going to have a quaternary ammonia compound in them, along with other things. Usually not bleach, because chlorine compounds will interact negatively with the ammonia, and so you can't mix ammonia and chlorine because it'll make chlorine gas out of it. And that's where you see people not, mixing their cleaning agents. But you might switch. One day, like for a week, most of the labs that I worked in, you would disinfect with bleach for a week, and then the next week you would use an ammonia, quaternary ammonia, and then the next week maybe use a phenolic or something, and you switch between those so that the microbes in that environment don't get used to one or the other, become resistant to one or the other. And so hospital settings often have this in place, and they will often have like disinfectants that you use that they will switch out that you guys wouldn't necessarily have to worry about, like the infection control officer will manage that stuff. But it is stuff that in a lot of clinical settings and lab settings that you often switch between different ones so that microbes don't become resistant to one or another, and they all work different ways. Surfactants work by disrupting membranes because they mimic that phospholipid, and so they just weaken it, and so now the cell contents can leak out, and other chemicals that you might combine them with can now get in. And so that's why chlorhexidine scrubs are so effective, because phenolics like chlorhexidine, they don't work that well on their own, and they can't really get into the cell, but you combine a surfactant with that, and now it can get into the cell and be more effective. And so these things will often work really well together. All right, aldehydes. Most of us know formaldehyde, glutaraldehyde, commonly used in embalming processes, If you guys have taken anatomy, then you know kind of what that smell is like of formaldehyde whenever you're preserving bodies and whatever. But obviously, also the other thing with this is that they are extremely dangerous compounds. So both glutaraldehyde and formaldehyde are dangerous. They both can sterilize. Glutaraldehyde is a little less dangerous than formaldehyde or formalin, which is our tincture version. Aqueous solution is what I meant to say. Tinctures have alcohol in them, and the water ones we would call aqueous solutions. So formalin is the aqueous solution, and formaldehyde is the actual compound that's in the water. But anyways, glutaraldehyde versus formaldehyde are both aldehydes. They can sterilize when used in high enough concentrations. At those concentrations, they're incredibly toxic. Even the fumes can be very toxic to people. And so one that we can use around people a little bit more is orthophthalaldehyde. I won't make you type it out, I promise you. But orthophthalaldehyde, also known as OPA, is a lot more like human friendly, but it doesn't sterilize. So that's the take back with that. Ethylene oxide. So this is a gas. There's ethylene oxide and chlorine oxide. These are gases that we can use to sterilize things. So if we're using chlorine oxide gas, that would be used to bubble through water to remove microbes. But ethylene oxide is a very commonly used gas to sterilize whole rooms and even buildings. And so we can seal off a room's ventilation system and pump in ethylene oxide gas, and it will sterilize everything in that room. Commonly used in BSL-4 labs at like the CDC and places like that, where they will switch lab to lab. They'll only work in a lab for like a month and then switch to a different BSL-4 lab. And then while that BSL-4 lab is not used, they'll just pump it through ethylene oxide gas to kill everything that's in there, like Ebola or whatever they're working on. So we can maintain as cleanly an area as possible and reduce the likelihood of spreading it around. But it's extremely combustible and it's extremely toxic as well as carcinogenic. So we can't use it around people. So it's something that if you use it in a room to sterilize a room, again, a situation that we call a chemiclave. It's like the autoclave. Everything that's in it gets sterilized, but we're using chemicals instead of heat and moisture and pressure. So if you are using ethylene oxide, you would have to treat the air after you release it back into the environment somehow in order to make it safe for the environment because it can be quite toxic. Then we have, that's using gases to sterilize things. Then we have the acids and the alkalis, almost never, I don't want to say never, but almost never sterilize. Now, if you have like super concentrated hydrofluoric acid, could you sterilize with that? I mean, probably, but who's using that, right? So practicality is what we have to think of here. So the acids and alkalis almost never actually sterilize, but we can combine them with other things to make them more effective. Changing the pH of something to be considerably acidic can significantly decrease Clostridium survival. So cleaning with vinegar is actually pretty effective at controlling our endospore bacteria from like being able to become vegetative because they don't survive. They can't be vegetative in the presence of the acid. So using vinegar to clean is actually pretty effective, but it's not going to sterilize, right? It's just a disinfectant. And then once that pH goes back to normal, like it's not working anymore. So that's just using pH to disrupt the stability of proteins and enzymes of cells. All right, chapter 12. Chapter 12 was our antimicrobial drugs. So we'll start off with some concepts of, I'm going to start with selective toxicity, something that I don't want people to get confused on. Selective toxicity, therapeutic index, and another one related to this, which is therapeutic window. I believe one of our learning objectives was to compare and contrast these concepts, okay? So selective toxicity is the idea that you want your drug to be toxic to the microbe, the bad guy. You want to be toxic to the pathogen, but not to your host, your patient. So you want the drug to be very toxic to the pathogen and non-toxic as possible to the patient. So that's the idea of that. That's selective toxicity. You want to be selectively toxic against the pathogen. The therapeutic index is the actual ratio for a drug. So if we're talking about ampicillin, the ratio between where that drug becomes toxic to the person versus where it's actually effective against the pathogen. But the ratio of those numbers to one another. So ratio of the toxic concentration to its effective dose. The effective dose is where it kills the pathogen. That literal concentration of the drug versus the toxic concentration where it causes bad side effects. The concentration of the drug where you're having side effects. So things like ampicillin, you're less likely to have these bad side effects as we learned about in our lab and as we learned about in chapter 12, because it affects the cell wall of bacteria, which we don't have that as part of our cells. So it's going to have a very low likelihood of having toxicity to the actual patient themselves. But at some point, there will be a risk for toxicity. So whatever that ratio is. So we want those to be quite far apart. We want to have low need of this drug. So very, very small amounts of the drug are toxic to the pathogen, but it takes a lot of the drug to be toxic to the patient, right? We want that ratio. We don't want them to be very close. So if it takes 5 milligrams of a drug to kill the pathogen, but at 5.5, you're becoming toxic to the patient, that's a really close ratio and could become very dangerous, right? So we want to keep them kind of very far apart if you have a choice, right? So you want to pick drugs that have a therapeutic index as far away from 1 as you can get. So 1-to-1 ratio is bad. And then the therapeutic window is just the difference between these two. Okay, that says difference. I promise I just wouldn't want me to write. Okay, so basically, like if 5 milligrams kills the pathogen, but 5.5 is toxic to the patient, then that therapeutic window is about 0.5 milligrams. So that's the therapeutic window, that difference between the two. So you want a big difference. You want a big therapeutic window. You want that therapeutic index to be far away from 1. And that concept is all driven by the concept of selective toxicity. So those are all different concepts. Those are all different things, but they all play within that idea of selective toxicity. All right. So anytime you're choosing an antimicrobial drug, you'll have to consider these things as far as how they affect your patient and which one is the best choice for your patient. So antibiotics are drugs that always treat bacterial infections, always. Antifungals treat fungi, antivirals treat viruses, antiprotozoals treat protozoa, but an antibiotic is more commonly going to be treating bacterial infections. And for our class, that's how we're treating it. Common ones to know for our cell wall stuff, this is supposed to be down a little, but that's okay. Cell wall stuff, you want to know the penicillins and other beta-lactams. So they're usually going to end in xylins. But another beta-lactam is cephalosporin. Carbapenem is also a beta-lactam. Some other ones that affect the cell wall will be vancomycin and bacitracin. These are cell wall guys. Again, this is a flashcard chapter. Like it's just a matter of knowing which ones affect the cell wall, which ones affect protein synthesis, which ones affect folic acid, whatever. So ones that affect protein synthesis usually block ribosomes from functioning somehow. That's how they work. So these are guys that affect protein synthesis. These are going to be in a group called the aminoglycosides. This is a group. Like the beta-lactams is a group. We water it down and say the xylins, but the beta-lactams is a group of antibiotics that affect the cell wall. Aminoglycosides are a group of antibiotics that affect the ribosomes. This also is a category that would include tetracycline, glycylcycline, cyclins in general. It's a fun one to try to write out. Glycylcycline. And then many mycins. Obviously not all mycins, because we said vancomycin affects the wall. So not that one, but most other mycins. These might fall into aminoglycosides or macrolides. And I won't ask you what the structure of macrolides are or anything like that, but many of our ribosome blocking guys fall into the macrolide category. So there's a category called aminoglycosides, category called the macrolides, and then there's the cyclins. So we can kind of group it that way. And then mycins can kind of fall in any of those. Erythromycin, streptomycin, those are guys that would fall into that protein inhibiting category. All right, folic acid inhibitors. We talked about this in our lab. This is going to be our sulfa drugs and trimethoprim, which is not a sulfa, but it does work in this category. And we often combine these guys with other things as well. Whether it's silver sulfadiazine, so that would be one that has sulfa in it, but also silver. And we know also our heavy metals can be used for controlling microbes. That was in chapter 11. So that's using heavy metal, silver, along with a sulfa drug. In this case, not tetracycline. Trimethoprim is usually used in combination with sulfamethoxazole, which was our SXT antibiotic in our lab. And that is Bactrim. When you combine those two together, that's what Bactrim is. So this includes Bactrim. For ones that affect the cell membrane, this is polymyxins and daptomycin, another mycin that's a deviant. But polymyxins affect the cell membrane. Nucleic acid inhibitors, the group that falls into this category is known as the fluoroquinolones. This is the group. And the drugs that fall into this group all end in floxacin. So this would include ciprofloxacin, levofloxacin, those drugs. If it ends in floxacin, it is a fluoroquinolone. And the way that it works is that it inhibits helicase from unwinding the DNA. You can't unwind the DNA, you can't separate it, and you can't make copies of it. So it inhibits nucleic acid synthesis that way. All right, so that's it for antibiotics. Our antivirals, the really only ones that you need to know, are going to be, there's kind of three groups. The flu blocking group, which really is Tamiflu, or I think Relenza is the other one, but they work the same way. They inhibit a special protein on the surface of flu virus called neuraminidase. And what neuraminidase does, and we'll learn about this more in Unit 4, but what neuraminidase does, we know a lot of people will categorize flu as H1N1 or H5N1 or whatever. The N is neuraminidase, the H is hemagglutinin. So these are molecules on the surface of the actual virus particles of flu. And neuraminidase helps with a lot of things for the virus. It's an ACE, so it's an enzyme. It's an enzyme on the surface of this flu. And what it does is help with the virus entering cells or exiting cells, but it also breaks down mucus. And so neuraminidase. So if you can block neuraminidase from allowing the virus to enter cells, exit cells, or break down mucus, then you can effectively inhibit the virus from replicating as effectively as it wants to. So Tamiflu blocks that, Relenza blocks that as well. Acyclovir is a antiviral that is commonly used for DNA viruses, including all of the herpes viruses. But it inhibits nucleic acid synthesis of DNA for those viruses. So it is more commonly used for HSV, but there are plenty of other DNA viruses that we've sometimes reached for acyclovir for. If you've ever heard of Valtrex for treating herpes, Valtrex is also known as valcyclovir, which is just a derivative of acyclovir. And then our last one are ones that target HIV, which target reverse transcriptase, integrase, or protease. If you talk about PrEP or STEP in preventing HIV, these are antiretrovirals. Antiretrovirals all target either reverse transcriptase, which is the thing that allows us to go from RNA to DNA. So it's reverse of what we're used to doing. That's reverse transcriptase. Either blocks that, blocks it from integrating into the genome, or blocks it from allowing it to process its proteins that make up the virus. And so if you block more than one, it's much more effective. So PrEP and STEP usually block more than one. If you can block reverse transcriptase and integrase, then usually you can keep somebody from getting infected altogether. So it's pretty effective at doing that in preventing infection. Once it's been integrated into the genome, all we can do is keep the viral load down, which would be keeping the viruses from being able to replicate. But we can't remove it from the genome yet. All right, antifungals. Most of these are azoles of some kind. There's one major deviant azole that we will talk about in our protozoa one in just a moment. So most of the azoles fall into this category, not all of them, but most. And then amphotericin B. These are the biggies. There are plenty of other antifungals that we could learn about, but I definitely want you to know the azoles. So this is ketoconazole, fluconazole, excuse me, ketoconazole, fluconazole, and miconazole. Common antifungals. More often than not, if you have a yeast infection or a fungal infection that you can't treat over the counter, they're going to prescribe fluconazole. Over-the-counter antifungals, like for athlete's foot or even in like monostat or something like that for yeast infections, it's usually miconazole. And then ketoconazole is usually prescribed as well. So it's a prescription level. So if you have a fungal infection in your sinuses or something, ketoconazole is usually what we're going to use. But if your ketoconazole and your miconazole aren't working, then we'll reach for amphotericin B. So it's a different kind of drug. It is a macrolide, but it works against fungi. So that's one that is less commonly used and more resistant treatment fungal infections. Next are antiprotozoal drugs, quinine and its derivatives, which ended in quin, like chloroquine. These are used to treat malaria. The quinines are used to treat malaria, and then commonly known for cause, like quinine itself used to be incorporated in like water. There's a fizzy water, it was mineral water, and they called it tonic water. And tonic water still today has minute traces of quinine in it because of bitterness to the flavor of tonic water. So if you get a gin and tonic has quinine in it. It was because people weren't taking their freaking quinine whenever British was trying to invade, India and stuff like that, where we had heavy incidents of malaria endemic in those areas. And people weren't taking their quinine, so they invented an alcohol that was cheap to make and easy to make out of resources in the region, which was using juniper berries, which is where we get gin from. The whole reason gin was invented was because people needed to take their quinine. And that's where gin and tonics come from. I think it's kind of interesting. So quinine is for malaria treatment. And then metronidazole is our one azole. And I remember it because I think of this is the azole that went to the big metro. It moved on to more complicated things. So that's how I remember that's metronidazole. But metronidazole is common antiprotozoal drug, more commonly for amoebas, but we also do use it for things like giardiasis, which is not an amoeba. It's got a flagella. It's a protozoa with a flagella, but it's more commonly an amoebicide. It is used for other protozoal infections, but it's also used for anaerobic bacteria like Clostridium difficile and other bacteria that would be living in anaerobic environments. Because we learned, it's the thing that I learned this semester as well, because metronidazole can be oxidized by oxygen in the air, so it's not going to work as effectively at inhibiting DNA and protein synthesis, basically. So it really only works effectively in anaerobic environments. So the bacteria living in those anaerobic environments are what we would use that for. We don't reach for it commonly if we can use one of the other more safe antibiotics, but it is one that we can use in kind of resistant treatment situations. Antihelminths, this will be praziquantel, ivermectin, and pyrantel. These are the three that we would need to know. Commonly used in people, but ivermectin is more commonly used in veterinary situations. So heartworms and stuff like that are treated with ivermectin. It can be very dangerous. My doggies, when I adopted Meatball and Spaghetti, we adopted Meatball and Spaghetti a little over a year ago. It was a year and a half ago. We adopted them, and they had heartworms. We were warned about like the risks of rescuing dogs that had heartworms, and because they had to treat them with ivermectin. And when the worms die from the ivermectin, their pieces can get lodged in their arteries and stuff like that because they live in the heart, right? So the pieces of the worms can get stuck in their veins and arteries and cause embolisms. And so they had to be, we had to keep them treated with ivermectin for a month. We had to keep them in their kennel, and we only took them out on leashes to go potty. And so for a whole month. It was the worst. But now they're running around living their best lives. So don't worry about them now. They're pooping on carpet and all sorts of stuff. So don't worry about it. But yeah, ivermectin, very commonly used in veterinary practices. All right, we learned about our Kirby-Bauer assay. I'm not going to go over this one. I feel like we've kind of beaten this horse, down as much as we can. Side effects, a lot of our issues with our side effects just have to deal with how these drugs actually affect our own biology, but also how they're like when your liver or your kidneys are metabolizing them, how much damage they cause to your kidneys or liver, as well as any like byproducts that they make that might be toxic. And so it's a whole bunch of like chemical knowledge for understanding why we get side effects and where and in which people. And it also is worth considering if you have a patient that has kidney disease, some of these antimicrobial drugs can get broken down into products that can affect the kidneys, so you might not want to reach for those. Superinfection, we've actually mentioned this a few times in our lab discussions. Superinfection is where you kill off the normal microbiota and then the things that survived will overgrow. Very common when you treat patients with antibiotics. that you'll kill off their normal gut microbiome. And then C. diff, because it has endospores, survives and then it overgrows and causes what we call C. diff, which is actually the disease known as pseudomembranous colitis, with diarrhea and pseudomembrane forming in the colon, which can lead to constipation as well as diarrhea. But this is common with C. diff, but it's also common in yeast, or if you take antibiotics for something, you can end up with a yeast infection. Not uncommon to have a UTI. You take antibiotics, then you end up with a yeast infection. You treat the yeast, then you can get BV because everything's been thrown off. And so it's just this compounding thing. But each of those is a different kind of super infection. So killing off the normal biota, and then the guys that were only there in small numbers now can overgrow. Drug resistance is either intrinsic or acquired. If you are a bacteria that makes an antibiotic, then you have to be resistant to the antibiotic you make. It's just inherent, right? So that's what intrinsic drug resistance is. But acquired is where you don't have it built into your genetic makeup naturally, but you've acquired it through usually horizontal gene transfer. So bacteria can do this on their own. And drug resistance can happen as a result of spontaneous mutation or horizontal gene transfer. So bacteria, because they multiply, and we know like bacteria, like E. coli, you can go from just having just inoculated your E. coli bacteria media, and then having millions and millions in just a matter of hours, right? So they're multiplying very fast, but they're also at risk because they're multiplying so fast of making just mistakes in their genetic code and putting the wrong A or the wrong T or something like that. And so that's what leads to spontaneous mutation. Now you could say, well, it's a 1 in a million chance that they're going to have spontaneous mutations that lead to random antibiotic resistance. But and so they've actually done these experiments where there's a video that's associated with this that I have in the lecture, I believe. But it's this auger plate, like the size of these bench tops here. And they put just plain E. coli, just like the E. coli we would use for our transformations, well studied, well documented, well known. Put it in that just plain auger on the end. And then there's a section where it has the amount of antibiotic you would normally use to treat an infection with E. coli. Then 10 times as much, then 100 much, and then 1,000, and then 10,000 times as much. And they will grow over that whole plate eventually. Just normal, bacteria. And we're talking within a matter of a week. They'll be in that 10,000 times the concentration. And it's wild, just from spontaneous mutation. They're not doing that through horizontal gene transfer. Other bacteria didn't give them those genes. So if we're saying 1 in a million, easy for bacteria to get a million, right? Easy. They'll do it in a matter of hours. They'll have a million. So you'll get your 1 in a million. So yes, those random mutations are actually, it's going to happen. So that's where antibiotic resistance will come from. You put the pressure on them to need to survive that antibiotic, and the ones that can survive will, and then they'll go on and then reproduce from that. We have a huge issue with drug resistance in the world in general, usually due to overprescription and shotgun approach. Like, hey, you have a sinus infection, let's just give you this antibiotic. It's probably some bacteria. It might not be, whatever. 70 to 80% of all like sinus infections and upper respiratory infections are going to be caused by viruses, but yet how many doctors reach for antibiotics whenever our patients are having these issues? And so it's just exposing your natural flora to those antibiotics, and then your flora might become resistant, but then your flora can cause a disease in other people because it's not their flora and whatever. So then that leads to the spread of these diseases. Shotgun approach and overprescribing of antibiotics, as well as obviously patients not adhering to their prescriptions the way that they're supposed to, all lead into the spread of antibiotic resistance. And we learned about horizontal transmission of genes before, but that's what this part down here is just reminding us about. Conjugation, transformation, and transduction are all modes of horizontal gene transfer by which, the bacteria can basically, transmit, hey, I can resist ampicillin. Would you like to too, buddy? And here's the gene for that. It's basically how that works. So how does drug resistance actually work? What did the bacteria need to do to be resistant? And there's all different mechanisms that are listed out here. The bacteria can make enzymes that can literally inactivate the drug, so a protein that breaks down some aspect of the drug. So they might do that. They might inhibit the ability for the drug to get in, uptake of the drug, or the permeability of the drug into the membrane. They can change their membrane or literally have something that changes the drug so it can't get in anymore. The drug is immediately eliminated. So they can create these channels, like bacteria will have like modified their normal channels in their cells that will just immediately like, oh, penicillin got in, out, and it just transports it out immediately. And so it never gets to act in the cell. So they can immediately eliminate the drug that way. They can also affect binding or affinity. If the drug has to bind to a receptor on the cell, all the cell needs to do is slightly mutate that receptor. Now the drug doesn't bind anymore and it can't get in. We can also affect different metabolic pathways. This is common associated with our folic acid synthesis inhibiting ones, our sulfa drugs, and our trimethoprim. Some bacteria, they just find a different way to make folic acid. They just find a different metabolic way to do it. And so they get around that, those drugs affecting them that way. All right. Chapter 15, this is our innate immunity stuff. So we've talked in chapter 11 and 12 about controlling the microbes in our environment or in our patients. But chapter 15 is getting into the concept of how our bodies start out dealing with our pathogens. It's really important to know that there's basically 3 stages to protecting your body. Primary, secondary, and tertiary, we call it, or however you want to look at it, but first line, second line, and third line. First line, our second line of defense, and then third. Your first line of defense is basically just basic things that keep microbes out. And it's usually like physical and chemical barriers. So barriers. Second line of defense is your innate immune response. And your third line of defense is your acquired immunity. So you have eyelashes. We all know why we got eyelashes. It's to keep crap from getting in your eye. Yeah, that's a first line of defense. Tears, even sweat, the oil on your skin. Now it does other things for your body too. Things like sweat keeps you cool, but the sweat also, excretes antimicrobial peptides. Has a certain pH that might be unfriendly to some microbes. The salt that is there can be unfriendly to some microbes. And so these are things that might have other functions in the body, but also act against them growing, even the pH in your stomach. So we have probably heard, and this is something I saw on Instagram the other day, and I want to bring it up because it applies. You've probably heard about how like 20% of infant botulism cases are caused from eating honey. Like babies aren't allowed to have honey, right? So the reason is because honey can have Clostridium botulinum endospores in it. Even your honey at home right now that you use just normal every day has Clostridium botulinum spores in it. Now the spores themselves can't grow in the honey. They can't. They're going to be endospores in there. And endospores don't make you sick, only the vegetative form. So if it can turn vegetative, then it can make you sick. Your stomach acid as adults is a low enough pH that your low pH keeps the endospores from being able to multiply and become vegetative. It just kills them. But babies don't have a low pH stomach yet, and they're drinking milk, which is alkaline all the time. And so babies don't have a low enough pH in their stomach, and so they are susceptible to Clostridium botulinum that your body would normally just take care of. So it puts into perspective things like that. That is a first line of defense, having a low pH in your stomach that babies don't have yet. They haven't developed that yet. They haven't needed to. So interesting, right? So I tell you guys that 20% of infant botulism cases come from honey specifically. What do you think the other 80% is from? Just the environment, just rando things in the environment. And that should put in perspective things like this, some things that people don't think about. Clostridium botulinum can actually be part of your microbiome in your vagina. So it's just saying. But is it flourishing and multiplying and making toxin there? No, it's probably not. If it was, then you would be having more issues. But in that environment and in that place, what it's doing and living and how it's existing isn't really harmful to you. If there were some reason for it to overgrow or something, then it might be an issue. But you don't see that very commonly, right? So it's not super common. But that can be a place where babies could be introduced to it. More commonly, it's going to be like the soil and just the ground and things around them. So nature. So you're going to see these cases more commonly in rural places or places that we consider underdeveloped countries where they don't have the same hygiene practices as we do for birth, which is also why you see tetanus is extremely common in infants in underdeveloped countries because they're giving birth in the dirt and places like that where the spores are, and then the babies get infected, and it's just everywhere. We just don't think about it.
So Do the endospores from the honey live inside of your?
Indefinitely, pretty much. Yeah. Because they live, right? They're dormant, they're inert. And so it is safe. They're not going to multiply in there or anything. And there's going to be minute amounts. And your body will clean them out. And if you're cooking with it, you'll probably be fine, you know? But if you're ever worried about it, mix it with acid like vinegar. And that will usually prohibit the spores from growing. But like taking salad dressing with it or something, for example, mix it with some vinegar and it should be fine. Yeah. But there's a lot of other things that we don't think about, right? Like even just rinsing off your lettuce, do you think that got rid of all the endospores? Right. So like it's just stuff like that that we kind of take for granted how many microbes our body just really deals with on a daily basis. And any of that stuff like the acid in your stomach or the salt on your skin, stuff like that, that's our first line of defense stuff. Okay. It's not specific to immunity necessarily, but does it protect us? Of course. So two key items that fall into this category are lysozyme and keratin. Lysozyme is an enzyme. It breaks down peptidoglycan. So it's naturally found in your your tears and your saliva, and it just breaks down peptidoglycan non-discriminately. And then keratin is a protein that seals and waterproofs the skin. It's the whole reason why if you get wet, you're not wet on the inside from that water, you know, it keeps it on the outside. So that's keratin. It also makes up a good proportion of like your hair and stuff like that. The immune system. All right, so now we're getting into the second line of defense. So once we start getting into our cells and having to defend us, one important aspect of our immune system is that we have to be able to tell the difference between self and non-self. So you know what to attack and what not to attack. And of course, this can get messed up. And that's where we get things like autoimmune or autoinflammatory diseases. So we have to know self versus non-self. And that's always identified by surface markers. And this is like baby talk here. Which surface markers, where, how, and when is very complicated. It's very, very complicated. Some of our common surface markers might be things like MHC, which we are talking about in chapter 16. So we get into MHC in chapter 16 stuff. But it's major histocompatibility complex, also known as HLA, which is human lymphocyte marker, based on human lymphocyte antigen, or leukocyte antigen. And basically that is the same thing. MHC and HLA are the same thing. It's just different names for them. And your body sees your MHC as self, but my MHC looks foreign to you, typically. And so if that's the case, and literally every nucleated cell in your body has MHC1 on its surface, it's just a surface marker that every nucleated cell in your body has. So some examples of non-nucleated cells would be like your red blood cells or your platelets. They don't have nuclei. But every other cell in your body has MHC1 on it. And so if your MHC1 looks different than my MHC1, and my body sees that as foreign and attacks it, this is where organ rejection comes from. And so that's talked more about in chapter 16, but that's an example of one of those surface markers that we see as self, and anything that deviates from that is non-self, and we attack. And so a lot of this stuff can be very general, or this can be very specific to a specific antigen. If it's very general, we're in the innate stuff. We're in chapter 15. If it's a specific antigen, the spike protein of HIV, for example, it's a very specific antigen. That's going to be the chapter 16 stuff. So that's acquired immunity. So getting into this. So our basic concepts of what the immune system is and how it's built and how it functions. Our lymphatic system. This includes your bone marrow, which is where all of your blood cells come from, red or white or otherwise. They all come from the hematopoietic stem cell in your bone marrow. That's where they all come from. And so bone marrow is included in your lymphatic system as well as your cardiovascular system, but that's where all of your white blood cells are going to start from, all of them, no matter what, innate or otherwise. They come from your bone marrow. The thymus, which is the area where geez, my screen's going wild here. Come on, just stay still. The thymus, which is where your T cells are going to mature. Your lymph nodes, which are just like, I equate them to like checkpoint stations, like when you're crossing borders into different countries, you have to show your passport and all of this stuff. It's like customs, basically. Your lymph nodes act that way. And so we'll talk about that just a second, but that's your lymph nodes, and then your lymphatic fluid. What the heck even is lymphatic fluid? So it's literally the fluid part of your blood. But what happens is you stub your toe or have an injury, you get stabbed or whatever it is. There's some sort of injury in your body, either from a pathogen or an actual trauma. And what happens is those cells in that area send out signals saying, oh, bad, bad is happening. Just very generically, like, bad is happening, we need help. So they send out those signals, and then your bloodstream rushes into that area because of vasodilation and things like that. The blood rushes to that area, which is where you get the redness and the swelling from. Then you have the white blood cells migrating out of the blood into the tissue, along with their signaling molecules and the fluid and the nutrients that they need and clotting factors and all that comes out of the blood. It's just the fluid part of your blood and your white blood cells moving into those areas. You don't have red blood cells crossing out of that. The only reason you could get blood and bleeding is because you actually damage the blood vessels and it's leaking out when it's not supposed to. But if you stub your toe and you didn't actually break open a blood vessel, then all the fluid is going to be moving in there because all those cells, all their nutrients, all the signals come in with just the fluid part of your blood. And so that's what lymphatic fluid is actually. So what happens is you've injured yourself, the fluid and all of the white blood cells and the signaling molecules and nutrients and whatever move into that area, causing swelling in that area. And then they do their job, cleaning up the area, which we'll get into a little more detail in a second. And once that cell is done, or once that fluid needs to go back in and mingle back in with the body and the swelling goes down, what happens is that fluid does not rejoin your bloodstream. It goes back via the lymphatic system because we're not going to let you bring in microbes that you'd introduced into the body straight back into your bloodstream. Your bloodstream is sterile. There shouldn't be microbes in it. And if you introduce microbes into your bloodstream, that's an open stadium where nobody's sitting in the seats. So it's a huge problem. So we have to filter out everything. You have to pass through every checkpoint with gold star all the way through before we let you rejoin the blood. And so you stub your toe, it gets swollen, the fluid rejoins back in, but it doesn't rejoin your bloodstream right away. It goes into the lymphatic vessels. The lymphatic vessels only move from the extremities to the heart, and it passes through tons and tons and tons of lymph nodes to get screened on the way back to the heart. And the way that the lymphatic fluid is being moved isn't by your heart pumping, because your heart isn't affecting that part. It's that your circulatory system is a closed system. So the only thing that moves your lymphatic fluid is by muscular movement. And so if you are ill or injured in any way, the best thing you can do for your body is move, even just a little bit. Get those muscles going, and that lymphatic fluid will get pumped back in and get filtered by your lymph nodes. So when I say filtered by your lymph nodes and they're getting checked by the cells there, what does that really mean? We'll talk about it more in chapter 16, but basically you have sentries that are like docked there, like your B cells, that are basically like literally looking at everybody's passport that goes through there. Are you meant to be here? Yes. Okay, you're good to go. But the second that they see somebody that they know, they're going to signal for your immune response. So they'll signal for more inflammation to keep that going. They'll signal for general innate immune cells that can just see you as bad or good and have general responses. But we're also going to activate our adaptive immune response or acquired immune response. And so that's going to be your B cells and your T cells will get activated. I'm not going into the detail with that here, but that stuff gets activated once we find somebody that doesn't belong there, regardless. So whether you find it in a lymph node or you find it in the tissue or you find it in the middle somewhere, once you find something foreign, we're going to activate our acquired immune response, our B cells and T cells. But those guys, we'll learn about in chapter 16, the B and T cells have to go through a huge process for activation and multiplying and everything like this. And that takes weeks, like sometimes 2 weeks, maybe, depending on what you're dealing with. It can take a week to 3 weeks to actually get a proper immune response going. And so what do you do for a week while microbes are growing inside of your body? And that's what your innate system is there for. It's just to keep things controlled until your adaptive response builds up strong enough for that specific antigen. And so here are our cells. So that's the idea, overall big picture stuff, right? And this also includes our associated lymphoid tissues. You have your gut associated lymphoid tissues, your skin associated lymphoid tissues, your mucosa associated lymphoid tissues. They're just like lymph nodes, but they're not in node form, but they're tissues that have a similar function located in specific areas of the body. Plasma and serum. We've talked about these before, yes? Plasma and serum. So if you clot the blood and then you separate out the fluid, then it's serum. But if it didn't clot and you separate the fluid, it is plasma. That's it. Okay. Mononuclear phagocyte system is basically a way for all of your white blood cells to move around between tissues, within tissues. It's our extracellular matrix that allows your white blood cells to basically move and communicate and act between the tissues, what we call the interstitium and places like that. And it's usually where we have higher concentrations of phagocytes, why it's called the mononuclear phagocyte system. This is where we have a lot of our like macrophages and dendritic cells just kind of waiting to see foreign stuff. Okay. All right, all of our white blood cells. We have two groups of white blood cells. The first group, the granulocytes. How are they defined? If you stain them, they look like they have granules in them. So they'll look like this. They might have nuclei that are weird and lobed. This might be their nuclei, but they've got all these little granules in there. Doesn't matter what they are. You don't need to know specifics of what they are for this course, but what they have a purpose always. The granules, basically what they are little packets of toxic things that they'll release or use to break down things that they eat up. And so that's what the granules are. So it's like general, like it's like carrying a machine guns. That's what it is. So it's just general fight back stuff. All right, so that's our granulocytes. Our agranulocytes are our other group. And these guys usually have one big old fat nucleus right in the middle. So this is their nucleus, and they don't have those visible granules. All right, so those are two groups. Or our granulocytes, the guys where we actually see the granules in them. Most of these guys are the phils. Okay, so this will be neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. All the phils are granulocytes. And there's one more that we need to know that it's granulocyte, which is the mast cells. Mast cells are more common in allergies, but they also are important in signaling when we have parasites. We don't see that a lot in the US, but it is important for that stuff. We'll talk about how mast cells work in chapter 17. But those guys are our granulocytes, okay? Our agranulocytes, these are our monocytes, which are these big old fat general reaction. These guys are very innate immune. They're not very specific to things, but they're innate phagocytes that are not granulocytes. And these guys, monocytes are in the bloodstream. Once a monocyte moves into a tissue, like into your lung tissue or into your skin or whatever, it's moved out of the bloodstream and into a tissue, it takes up residence there and it goes through changes and becomes a macrophage or a dendritic cell. So these are all the same thing. So you have like a monocyte that's in the blood. And monocytes are here. Once it moves out of the blood, it either becomes a macrophage or a dendritic cell. Dendritic cells are usually going to be in the skin, and the macrophages are like in other tissues in the body. So we have alveolar macrophages in our alveoli in our lungs, for example. So, but yes, so I would say easily the most important cells of your immune system are going to be your monocytes and their derivatives, macrophages, dendritic cells, because these guys are the go-between between your innate and your acquired. Your acquired is usually never going to interact with your pathogens very well if you don't have the macrophages to kind of bring the stuff to them. And so, yes. And so basically, okay, so let's see. What goes on is we have I talk to you guys all the time about phagocytosis and white blood cells eating up bad guys and whatever. So that process is called phagocytosis. Our phagocytes are our major phagocytes are going to be your neutrophils, which your neutrophils are your most populous white blood cell that you have. You should have about 55% of your white blood cells should be neutrophils. So you have neutrophils, and then your monocytes and their derivatives, which are your macrophages and your dendritic cells, and sometimes your mast cells, but I don't focus on that very much. So these are the cells that commonly, definitely your neutrophils and your monocytes, macrophages and dendritic cells are just derivatives of those, right? So those are your phagocytes. So when I say about your phagocytes eat up this, or this blocks phagocytosis or whatever, these are the guys that are doing that. And that's not all that many cells when you have all these different kinds of cells in your body, but that should put into perspective how active these guys are and how important they are in actually phagocytosing, eating things up. Other cells, if they even have phagocytic ability, don't even hold a candle to the action that you have with neutrophils, monocytes, and macrophages. Okay. These guys, all of our phagocytes, all of them recognize PAMPs. So they recognize a PAMP. And what the PAMP is are very general markers of a bad guy. So these are pathogen-associated molecular patterns. And so, yeah, you do need to know that acronym, right? But it does also kind of tell you what it is. It's a pathogen-associated molecular pattern. A pattern that you can say, if I see this pattern, it's probably a pathogen. Examples of this are going to be peptidoglycan, obviously, right? If you see that in your body, that's definitely not self. It's going to be LPS. What else do we call LPS? Endotoxin, right? If you see that in your body, it's probably a pathogen. Shouldn't be there. Another one, double-stranded RNA. Your body doesn't have double-stranded RNA. So that's probably a virus if you see that. So there's other ones too, but these are very common ones that if your body sees these things, these are PAMPs. Are these antigens? Not really, because an antigen would be something specific to a specific pathogen. But all bacteria, generally, all bacteria have peptidoglycan. It's not a specific antigen, but your body can see this as if I see peptidoglycan, probably bad. If I see LPS, probably bad, you know? So these aren't specific to a specific pathogen like an antigen is, but they are pathogen associated molecular patterns. And so what happens is you stub your toe or you step on a nail, let's say. You step on a nail and a microbe gets into your body. The cells nearby are being like, help, a bad thing's happening. My neighbor, he got completely shredded in too, and whatever. So they're sending out signals for help. Usually that's going to be things like mast cells or other cells that are just in the area naturally will be responding to the damage and picking up on, you know, this is supposed to be inside of a cell. This isn't inside of the cell. Why is this out? Probably damage, that sort of stuff. So reading the room and basically saying, we've got a problem here, and releasing inflammatory markers like histamine and stuff like that, leading to bringing in more of the blood flow. Bringing in blood flow, bringing in our neutrophils. Neutrophils are going to be our first guys on the scene. So neutrophils come in there and they just start eating things up and digesting it. They're like, oh, I see a PAMP, eat it. Oh, I see another PAMP, eat it. Oh, I see a PAMP, eat it. So neutrophils will do that till they die, or they'll poop out the waste products that they make from doing that. So they're just doing that very non-discriminately, just eating and killing, eating and killing, eating and killing. That's all they do. Then macrophages get called into the scene. When neutrophils start eating stuff up and digesting it, they're sending out signals to call for macrophages, dendritic cells, whatever, right? So a monocyte gets a signal from the bloodstream and comes into the tissue and becomes a macrophage, let's say, if that hasn't already happened, if they're not already there. And so the neutrophils have just been eating up and dying or pooping out whatever they have, not really doing anything, not sending out signals for, I found this specific thing. Well, what the macrophage does is macrophage comes in and it eats up the dead neutrophils. It eats up all the damaged stuff around there. It eats up, you know, the waste from the neutrophils, whatever's been going on there. And it eats those up and it says, interesting, I don't know what this is. What is this? And then takes it to your lymph node or to a T cell, wherever it can, whoever it first comes into contact to. And it's basically holding it out, being like, does anybody recognize this? Does anybody know what F this is? And looks around for somebody to say, hey, do you see this bracelet? Does anybody know what this is? And once a T cell comes along and says, I've been waiting on this bracelet my whole damn life. I've been living to see this bracelet. And you've got one T cell in your whole body that sees that bracelet. And then that T cell will get activated because that macrophage brought it to it. So we'll get into the details of how that works and the specifics of that in chapter 16, obviously. But it's important to understand the role that the macrophages have there. So they are going in, they're the cleanup crew, but they're also not just cleaning up. They're saying, do we need to be worried about this specific thing? And then finding the guy that fights that specific thing. So we can be more specific. And I'm telling you, your T cells and your B cells, they do 99% of the work in clearing out your infections. And so if you're getting better, it's thanks to your B cells and your T cells. But they don't get activated if they're not, you know, called to the site, if they're not seeing the specific antigen, not getting the right signals and all sorts of stuff like that. So really important that we understand the role of the macrophages and the monocytes in that, okay? All right, we kind of tracking the general concept here. All right, so let's get into our inflammatory response here. So what is inflammation and what's the point of it? So first things first, right? You stubbed your toe and those mast cells and other injured cells in the area are calling out for inflammation. And basically they're sending out signals saying we're damaged. And then the inflammatory response comes. Well, those signals that they're sending out are called cytokines. And cytokines come in a lot of different forms, but the major things that they do is that these are produced by immune cells. They can be produced by tissue nearby that's been damaged or blood cells. So a lot of cells can make them, but they are very commonly made by immune cells to regulate how we're responding to things. And so cytokines are just signal molecules. They're just signals telling the body what to do. And so they can induce or dampen the inflammatory response. They can lead to vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So this can modulate how much blood flow you're getting into an area versus out. So in case you haven't noticed, if you stub your toe, right, is blood flowing into the area? Obviously, it's swelling, it's getting red, increased. So that's vasodilation on the way in. But do we want to let blood flow out just freely and quickly? No, we want to keep everything there. We want everything to build up in that area. So we have vasoconstriction on the way out. And so this keeps that blood flowing into that area for as long as we need it until we need to go back to normal, basically homeostasis and whatever. So we can modulate how much blood is going into the area, whether it's collecting there. And these cytokines also regulate lymphocyte growth and response. Signs of inflammation, we have our Latin terms. If you guys speak Spanish, this will be way easier for you. But rubor, calor, dolor, and tumor. Rubor is redness. Calor, like calories, if you guys don't know, calor means heat. And a calorie is literally a measure of how much heat is given off when you like burn a cube of gram of sugar or some crap like that. And so how much heat is actually given off by burning something. So that's really what a calorie is. But rubor, calor is warmth, tumor is swelling, and dolor is pain. And those are like the four major signs of inflammation. And then a fifth one that we can tack on there that doesn't have really a Latin term, but something that you do see with inflammation can be loss of function, either complete or partial. Purpose of our inflammation, the whole reason that we are doing this is just to attract our immune cells. And so why do we have pain? Well, literally because you have nerve damage. So then why do you have nerve damage? To alert you that there's damage being done in your area. So you know if you stub your toe and it hurts, maybe I should make sure that things are going to go okay with healing that up, right? So it makes you as a multicellular organism aware of damage in your body. So pain has its purpose. The swelling happens because the fluid is bringing everything in there to the site with the signaling and everything like that. The redness is happening because the blood is bringing that fluid there. And then, you know, the tumor itself is that swelling aspect. So all of these things have a purpose to bring your immune cells there because there's been damage and we need to repair things. So it's for repair, but it's also to make sure we're screening to make sure that pathogens aren't getting in or out of the area. And all of that is the purpose of inflammation. We track our immune components. We have tissue repair that gets initiated, and we're also going to isolate harmful substances. So we allow blood to flow in, but we're keeping it from flowing out. We're also making walls around potential infectious areas, but we call them granulomas. So granuloma is when your white blood cells kind of wall off an area where we have pathogens. So it keeps it in that area, preferentially, if we can, like what you see with pimples and boils. Those have been like walled off into a specific local area, and to keep it from spreading to other areas. All right. Events and inflammation usually have your injury reaction, whatever. You damaged some tissue and we sent out signals saying damage was done. We have our vascular reaction, bringing blood to the area and minimizing blood flow out. Then we had the development of edema and pus. So edema is the movement of the fluid into that tissue area, that tissue compartment. And pus is usually made up almost entirely of neutrophils, though we will have bacteria and microorganisms in there as well, but it's almost entirely neutrophils. And it's just your white blood cells going in there to eat up any damaged tissue as well as damaged microbes that are in the area or whatever. And then we have our actual healing and scarring that aren't mediated as much as by your white blood cells, so much as is by your platelets and clotting factors and things like that. Your body doesn't care how pretty you look afterwards, right? It just wants to seal everything off. And so that's where we get the development of scars from. What happens with like when I say like, oh, we're calling out for help and now our white blood cells are moving in from our bloodstream and into our tissues, because neutrophils don't just stay in your tissues, right? They're in your bloodstream. And so they get called out of the bloodstream and into the tissues by those cytokines. But the way they move through the actual blood vessel, because your blood is a closed system, but it's maintained closed because you have blood vessels. And so in your capillaries, where you only have like one cell as making up the whole wall of your capillary, that the white blood cells can actually squeeze between. And that process is called diapedesis. And so that's what diapedesis is. This is not spelled correctly on here. Diapedesis. I remember because the ped reminds me of the walking, kind of like amoebas do with that pseudopodia, the ped, like podiatry. Anyways, I remember that one, but I spelled it when I typed up this. All right, so fever is part of your inflammatory process. Things that trigger your fever are called pyrogens. I like that word. I feel like it's easy to understand that a pyrogen like a pyromaniac. It's going to increase the temperature, right? So pyrogens induce fevers. Pyrogens can be made by your own cells. So your cell might say something foreign is going on. I'm going to make pyrogen because I saw this foreign thing. And so it'll send out signals saying we need a fever. But also certain things made by bacteria, like certain toxins, and even LPS itself, that lipopolysaccharide endotoxin, immediately themselves trigger pyrogens. So they act as pyrogens, triggering fever. So pyrogens can be endogenous, made by your cells, or exogenous, made by like the whatever pathogen. All right. So, but anyways, so the whole point of a fever is to increase your cell's metabolism and provide a protective response activity. What this is really referring to is increasing the activity of your white blood cells. You increase your cells' heat. Heat is energy for your body, and your cells are going to move faster and do better work, right? To a point, right? So to a point. And this also decreases microbial enzymes from being able to work. So it inhibits the microbes while increasing the function of your own cells. It decreases the microbes from growing and being able to function while increasing your cell's functionality, and also allows for increasing the speed by which your adaptive immunity is going to adapt. It just helps your body do everything faster and better, and inhibiting the growth of many of our microbes. Now, this is a wild concept because your body will keep increasing its temperature if it's not effective at this temperature. We'll raise it to 101. It's not working good enough, raise it to 102. It's not working good enough, 103. And it'll keep freaking doing that to its own detriment. And so your body will actually heat itself up to the point that eventually your proteins will denature, yours will. And so it's wild to think that your body's just raising its temperature to keep the bad guys from surviving and just is willing to put your life at risk to do that. But it's something that evolutionarily we've kept, and it's been effective enough that it's still a trait that we have. But it is that simple. It's just raising the temperature to increase how your body is working and decrease the ability of the microbes to survive, because the microbes are more sensitive to it. Eventually, if you get to a fever of 105 to 106, you start denaturing your own proteins in your brain. And so then at that point, that damage can become permanent. So we don't want fevers to go anywhere near 105 or higher than that. So become very concerned if it gets to 105. Getting to 106, you're almost certainly going to have brain damage associated with it. So, but your body will do it. But there is a point to it, right? So it's up to you as to whether or not, when you're treating a fever, how high is the fever and how uncomfortable is the person really when they're dealing with the illness. If you're a little bit mildly uncomfortable and you have a fever of like 101, maybe let it run its course. But if you're starting to rock a fever of 104 and you're sore all over, take the Advil, like do something to help your body out and keep things at a more comfortable setting. Obviously, if you're dealing with kids, then you definitely want to consult doctors a little bit more, because it gets tricky as what their bodies can handle versus what adults can, and that sort of stuff. All right. Finally, interferon and complement. First of all, interferon is a cytokine. It's a signaling molecule. Okay. And it's something that your cell, if your lung cell becomes infected, whatever. I don't know why they do that just randomly. But if your lung cell becomes infected with flu virus, let's say, and that specific lung cell can send a signal to neighboring lung cells saying that flu virus is coming, virus is coming. And that's what interferon is, it's that signal. So it's the call from your neighbor telling you that somebody's breaking in their house, so grab your shotgun. You know what I mean? So it's that. So I like that analogy, because like you imagine like your neighbor Bob gets attacked and he's in his closet hiding, but he has his phone. He's like, hey, they're breaking in my house. There's not much I can do from me, but get your shotgun out and be ready, because I bet they're coming to your house next. And that helps. And so your cells can prepare and make antiviral stuff ahead of time, but they might not be ready for this attack. And now they are. So interferon is commonly used in like treatments and stuff like that to help your body with that sort of signaling, to help your cells know like, hey, you've got something going on. We need to start working on inside stuff is going bad. Anyways, so inside stuff is going bad, and we need to be mindful that we need to take care of stuff going on inside the cells, and that's what interferon will do. So we'll even combine interferon therapy with like cancer stuff, because cancer is an inside problem, right? Okay, complement cascade. There's two things that we need to focus on category-wise with this. The first thing is, how is it activated? And the second one is what it does. So complement is just a set of proteins that are always in your bloodstream. You don't need to make your body make it. It's always around and they're always in an inactive state. But once you see one of the three triggers on how it's activated, there's three different kinds of ways to activate it. Once you see one of those three things, then it causes, let's say you're a complement protein, you're just trotting around in the bloodstream and you're just floating around having a great old day. And then you see, I don't know, LPS. You see LPS in the bloodstream floating around. You would be like, okay, we're ready to go. And you say you're ready to go, and you say it to everybody else, get ready, get ready, get ready, get ready. Tell all your friends to get ready. And then you guys would go out and tell all your friends to get ready. And then they'd tell their friends to get ready and whatever. We're fighting, get ready to do the thing. And so it only takes one to start with, but then you see a cascade of all the other complement proteins reacting as a result of that. And so that's the complement cascade. And so whatever that triggering molecule is, there's three different ways to trigger complement. You either trigger it with antibody. So if complement sees antibody has bound to something, then it's like, why is an antibody binding to something? That should only happen when something is seen by antibody, right? There's an antigen being interacted with an antibody. There's antigen. We need to do something. So there's that way. That's the classical pathway. So it's important to remember it's called the classical pathway when antibody regulates it. The other way is through LPS or other, like similar to PAMPs, okay? But PAMPs are seen by cells. The complement pathway is just proteins. And so this protein seeing basically similar thing to PAMPs. But they are usually, we call this the alternative pathway. So just general markers like LPS patterns, usually, okay? Very similar to PAMPs, though. So we have the classical pathway activated when we see antibody. The alternative pathway, most typically this is LPS, but it could be other patterns as well. And then the third one is the lectin pathway. So there's these proteins called lectins in your body that bind to mannose. And mannose is sugars that we only really see on the surface of bacteria. So it's just another pattern that we see, but it's just a specific pattern. And so if there's mannose and lectin has bound to it, complement is going to be like, uh-oh, what you doing over there, lectin? Oh, you bound to mannose? Call your friends, and then you call the friend and whatever, and a complement cascade starts. So three ways you can activate complement. The classical pathway, if you see antibody, the alternative pathway, usually LPS or something similar, or the lectin pathway, when proteins called lectin see mannose on the surface of bacteria, usually. Okay, we track in how we activate the complement. All right, the next is then, okay, what? So you've called all your friends, all the complement, called all their friends. What does that mean? What's actually going on? Well, there's a whole ton of different proteins, like 50 different proteins involved in complement. But depending on which one is activated and where can lead to different results and how fast. But I'm not going to get into the details of that. Generally speaking, the steps once you activate it, you have that initiation. Oh, I see you. You're binding lectin. Lectin, you're binding to a mannose over there. That's the initiation. The complement saw whatever initiated it. Antibody, lectin binding to mannose, or LPS. Okay, so that's the initiation. Then we have amplification. That's whenever it's calling out to the friends to call the friends, right? We have that whole thing going on. So what happens? The protein sees that antibody bound to something and it changes its shape. Then it causes the other proteins to change their shape. And then they cause other proteins to change their shape. That's the amplification. All right. Then polymerization. It's after you've called all your friends and after your friends have called your friends and we've all got our weapons with us. Now we're going to band together and create an army. And that creation of that army is that polymerization. And so what happens when we polymerize complement is it builds a structure called a membrane attack complex. So after I've called you and you've called all your friends, we're going to come together, all activated, and we're going to bind together, literally polymerize. We're going to, each of us be activated parts of the complement pathway, and we're going to polymerize and bind together. This is polymerization. And it's going to build the membrane attack complex. And so what we've done is we've formed this wall of activated complement proteins and pushed open the membrane of whatever we see. Lectin bound to mannose on bacteria. Imagine like the bacteria would be like the size of this building, right? And we would be the complement proteins, but we all band together and we push open its membrane with this membrane attack complex. And now its insides can leak out. And that causes lysis of our target bacteria. So this is our membrane attack complex called the MAC. So that's where that polymerization is playing in, okay? So we can build the membrane attack complex. That leads to cytolysis of our target cell, cytolysis, cell breaking open, okay? So this is our membrane attack complex effect. other things that complement can do. Even if you didn't get here in time, you got called by your friends and you didn't get here in time to build our membrane attack complex, other things you can do, you can help signal for more inflammation. Remember, inflammation has its purpose, right? We're calling in white blood cells to eat up bad things and whatever. So you can call in for white blood cells to eat up bad things. Other things you can do is something called opsonization, which is important for both chapters 15 and 16. This is a fancy word for creating handles for the phagocytes to grab onto. They're molecular handles. So what it is that let's say that, all of our other friends built the membrane attack complex, but you come up and you're a little behind or whatever, you're doing something else. You come in and you just stick onto the surface. You're like, yeah, I saw that the lectin was bound to that mannose and I see you guys built the membrane attack complex. I'm just going to sit over here. And by you just sitting there, a macrophage comes in. It got called in by the inflammation response that you all triggered. Macrophage comes in. It can't bind on because this cell has a capsule. It can't eat you. But you're sitting there, you're like, I'll grab onto you, buddy. And you hold on. And now the macrophage can eat him. That's what opsonization is. So it's a molecular handle for the phagocytes to grab onto to help with that process. Does that make sense? Okay, we did it, y'all. You did chapter 15. And it's a pretty good setup. So I'm going to go through the questions really quickly. Remember, I always have these little blips here that have a little more information on the commonly missed topics that I'm not going to go over, but I'm going to go to the questions really quickly. All right, so which methods sterilize and which ones don't is often a difficult one for people, just remembering which ones can sterilize and which ones can't. And again, it's a memorization thing. This is one that I don't really know. I don't have like a good concept for this one as much as it's just remembering. But understanding how the processes work can help with it. So which of the following methods is most appropriate for sterilizing? Can ionic radiation sterilize? Yes, this is the one that causes that very significant damage through ionizing the molecules that are involved. Pretty serious stuff. We call that cold sterilization. So that one can. Can boiling? We've said multiple times that boiling cannot sterilize. Can rubbing alcohol? Typically, alcohols are not going to be sterilizing agents. They are just disinfecting agents. And then pasteurization, which we talked previously about how it doesn't sterilize, right? So the one that you're going to use for sterilizing from this list would be the ion. This is a very common type of question that we will see on Unit 3. I'll just give you a list of things, which one can sterilize, or a list of things, which one doesn't sterilize. Pretty common one for Chapter 11 questions. There's a lot of this. All right, in a clinical setting, which sterilization method is commonly used to ensure that surgical instruments are free of all microorganisms? So if we need to be free of all microorganisms, and it calls it sterilization also. We need to sterilize, we need to remove endospores. So which of these can be used for sterilizing? We already said pasteurization can't be. Autoclaving is probably our best bet. Remember, this is using moist heat and pressure. Yeah. Ultraviolet radiation, if you're wanting to ensure that the front and back of all of your instruments were actually sterilized, UV radiation is not as practical for sterilization for that. If it's just a surface and you don't need to get an underside of something, then UV might be okay if you leave it on for long enough, but autoclaving is faster and it's more effective. And as long as the steam touches it, it gets sterilized. And boiling, we already know doesn't work. All righty, chapter 11. This is our chemical ones. So our chemical ones that are used, this one in particular is done with hydrogen peroxide. So this stuff will go over how a hydrogen peroxide works in a little bit more detail if we're interested. What is the primary mechanism by which hydrogen peroxide, so again, it's H2O2, hydrogen, there's a hydrogen or oxygen. How does it work to control microbial growth? It's got our oxygens in it, right? It's not our halogen, it's not an aldehyde or anything like that. This is our oxidizing agent. So how do oxidizing agents work? They're going to basically have chemical reactions with things to move electrons around, right? So again, redox reactions. If you remember anything for redox, it's moving electrons around. All right, so does it disrupt the microbial cell wall by enzymatic activity? So it's not an enzyme, right? And so we're not going to be doing that. Does it cause cell death through the production of reactive oxygen species? We also might call these free radicals, right? So yes, it does do that. Reactive oxygen species are oxidizing agents. They're going to cause electrons to be moving around. Does it alter the pH of the environment, inhibiting microbial enzymes? I can't guarantee you that hydrogen peroxide can't change the pH some, but is that the primary mechanism by which it acts? No. It forms a physical barrier. No, it's going to be that reactive oxygen species one. All right, in a healthcare setting, how is hydrogen peroxide commonly used to ensure the safety of medical equipment? In healthcare, do we use it to coat medical instruments to prevent microbial contamination during storage? Do we use it to apply it directly to wounds to speed up healing by reducing microbial load? Maybe. So I'm going to put a little star next to this one because I want to go through my choices first, right? Is it employed to disinfect surfaces and sterilize equipment, especially through its oxidative properties? This sounds like a better answer, right? And we'll come back to B in a second and why it's wrong. Is it added to solutions to enhance effectiveness of other disinfectants? Typically not, because it's a reactive oxygen species. It might react with other chemicals, so we don't usually mix it with other things. So we're not coating the instruments, right, to prevent them from storage. That's not what we're doing. That was pretty straightforward one, that why that's not happening. But why is B wrong? Do we apply it directly to wounds to speed up healing by reducing microbial load? Can it reduce microbial load? Yeah, I mean, it will reduce microbial load, but it doesn't speed up healing. Why? Because it also causes damage to our cells. So that's why this one's wrong. Make sense? So it's going to be C there. All right, chapter 12, these are our drugs. The idea of that therapeutic index, I'm going to write these ones out again just really quick. Therapeutic index is our ratio one. Ratio of where the drug works, what's like effectiveness. Let me erase that. The ratio of where it's effective against the pathogen, right? Versus when it's toxic to the patient. Okay, so that's the therapeutic index. Selective toxicity is a concept. So it's not an actual ratio, right? So it's the concept that you want drugs to harm the pathogen and not the patient. That's the concept of that. And then the therapeutic window is basically the difference, not the ratio, but the difference between the effective dose and the toxic dose. So therapeutic index, the ratio, therapeutic window, the actual literal difference between the two. How big of a span can you work within? Selective toxicity, the concept. All right, so what does a high therapeutic index indicate about a drug? If it's a high therapeutic index, does the drug have a high risk of causing severe side effects, even at low doses? Hold on really quick. I think I have a thing on this. I did. I thought I had more notes on it, but I had more breakdown that I wanted to do, but I didn't put it on here. Whatever. All right. So does the drug have a high risk of causing severe side effects even at low doses? It's not really telling us that, right? So if it has a high risk of side effects at low doses, that's only one side. That's only the toxic to patient part, really. The drug has a large margin. So it's not going to be A. The drug has a large margin of safety between the effective dose and the toxic dose. Is probably this one. So this is showing us that we have a high therapeutic window. So with the ratio between those, the bigger the number, far away from one, right? We want it to be like very, very big difference between what's effective and what is toxic, right? So we want a high therapeutic index there. The drug is effective only at very high doses, making it less safe. I mean, that's not necessarily true. Even if a drug is effective at high doses, that doesn't immediately insinuate that it's unsafe, right? So that's kind of wrong just because of that thinking, but that would be more specific to a specific drug at a specific interaction. Overall, our therapeutic index, we're leaning towards B, right? It's going to be the large margin of safety between the effective dose and the toxic dose. But if you have a high therapeutic index, does it mean that the drug's effectiveness is closely tied to its potential for causing resistance? Therapeutic index has nothing to do with the antibiotic resistance, right? So B was our answer there. In a healthcare setting, why is it important to consider a therapeutic index of a drug when prescribing medication? Do we want to determine the drug's color and taste preferences? I mean, that'd be nice if you could, but doubtful that that's going to be a choice. To ensure that the drug is administered at a dose that maximizes therapeutic effects. Yes. So this is the effectiveness of the drug while minimizing the risk of toxicity. Yes. So we want to use therapeutic index. Probably B is our answer. All right. Why else would we want to consider therapeutic index? Would it be to evaluate the cost effectiveness of the drug? It has nothing to do with that. Or predict the drug's effectiveness based on patient age and gender. Now, might age and gender have something to do with the effectiveness of a drug? Potentially, but is that the overall reaching idea? Right. So that's not our most correct answer. If a drug affects your hormones, gender might be important in your toxicity, but that would just be part of the therapeutic, the selective toxicity, right? And then how much it affects you would be dealing with that therapeutic index. All righty, let's do this. Okay, so next are antibiotics for treating protein production. So remember, most of these guys are going to be affecting our ribosomes somehow. And most of them are going to be mycins, erythromycin, azithromycin, streptomycin, gentamicin, not including, vancomycin or daptomycin. Those were our two deviants, right? Okay, and then our cyclins. So many of these fall into the group of aminoglycosides. Then we also have some macrolides that fall into this group. I can't spell today. Macrolides. And then we'll also have the cyclins. So these are the major, this is how I would like kind of water this down. And most of these guys end in mycin or MICIN. So many of them do anyways. All right, so which of the following antibiotics affects protein production? So carbapenem, this is one that affects the cell wall. Again, chapter 12, it can be very effective with our flashcards, right? So this is a cell wall one, carbapenem is. Aminoglycosides are the ones that affect the protein production. Ciprofloxacin affects nucleic acid. And metronidazole is one that we use for protozoa and anaerobic bacteria. And the way that it works is usually by affecting nucleic acid synthesis. Okay, so our answer here is going to be B. Why might tetracycline be preferred for treating gram-negative infections as opposed to amoxicillin? So we know amoxicillin affects the cell wall. Gram-negatives, they have a very thin cell wall, but they also have an outer membrane. So they're not as reliant on the cell wall, which we learned about in lab, right? So let's go through it. Amoxicillin is easily metabolized by gram-negatives. That's not the reason. Tetracycline targets protein production, while amoxicillin targets cell walls, and gram-negatives have very little cell wall. It's going to be B, probably. Amoxicillin, does it enhance protein production? No, it prohibits cell wall synthesis. D, tetracycline attacks the gram-negative outer membrane. No, it works by prohibiting protein production. So B was our answer there. All right, next one is our nucleic acid inhibitors. Which of the following antibiotics affect nucleic acid synthesis? Nucleic acid synthesis, the group is known as fluoroquinolones, and all of them end in floxacin. Easy. I'm not going to ask you about other antibiotics that affect the nucleic acid synthesis other than the metronidazole one, right? So that was our weird only anaerobes. So this is floxacin, ciprofloxacin A. Carbapenem, again, the cell wall. Amoxicillin, cell wall. Glycylcycline, protein synthesis. Why might the fluoroquinolones have negative side effects in the human bodies they're being administered to when their infections are the real targets? Well, despite your intentions that, you're trying to inhibit DNA synthesis in the bacteria, do we also need to synthesize our DNA? Of course. So that's the problem with fluoroquinolones. You block DNA synthesis, you block DNA synthesis. So fluoroquinolones, do they cause bacteria to secrete toxins? No. Do fluoroquinolones stop protein synthesis by affecting the ribosomes? No, they're affecting nucleic acid synthesis. Do fluoroquinolones affect nucleic acid synthesis, which we also do in our cells? Yes. Do fluoroquinolones, are they too quickly removed from the bloodstream? No, that's not the issue. It's that blocking nucleic acid synthesis, which our cells also do. Luckily, we are multicellular, so we can handle some damage and recuperate from it, but they can be toxic. Video, maybe? I don't know what that is. All right, someone's having more fun than us. All right, so chapter 15, I think I have 3 questions for this and then we'll be done. So the first one is the purpose of fever. Okay, so locking that stuff. We have enhanced immune response and activity, inhibiting pathogen growth, improving healing, faster recovery, and signaling that there is infection. So improving that stuff. So we will kind of make little notes of that. So inhibit the microbes and increase the patient's overall immune function. Which summarize it like that. And healing. It's kind of 2 big ideas, but there's other parts to it, right? So which of the following is a benefit of fever in the context of an infection? Does fever decrease the production of white blood cells? No. Does fever enhance the ability of immune cells and speed up the healing process? Yes. Does fever increase the availability of iron in the bloodstream, promoting pathogen growth? So one thing that I didn't go into detail on, and one thing that we do need to know about fever, is that during the fever process, the pyrogens actually cause your body to hoard iron away because microbes need iron too. And so we don't have as much, the soluble iron will get hoarded away and ferritin will get hoarded away so that the microbes can't use it. So it's actually the opposite of C that will be happening. Fever, does it decrease the body's metabolic rate? It speeds it up. So B is our answer there. In a clinical setting, why might a fever be a significant indicator for a healthcare provider? Does it suggest that the patient has a cold, which requires immediate antiviral treatment? Is that what fevers overall do for us? Of course not. That's too specific. And often, even with colds, you very have minor fevers if you have any at all, too. Does it indicate the presence of an infection or inflammatory condition that might need further investigation? That's more broad, and that's, I'm thinking, probably what the answer is going to be. Does it confirm that the patient is dehydrated and needs intravenous? They might also be, but that's not what the fever does for us. Does it guarantee that the patient has a bacterial infection rather than a viral one? We know that's not true. We can have plenty of viral infections like flu and COVID that definitely raise your fever. So B is our answer there. All right, the complement pathway. So remember, there's the classical pathway, the lectin pathway, and the alternative pathway. So I'm going to write those out as our little cheat sheet notes. Classical is activated by antibody. Alternative, it's going to be activated by patterns like LPS. And then the lectin pathway is going to be activated by lectin binding to mannose. So we'll just say mannose on bacteria to remind us that that's what it's for. All right, which of the following correctly describes the initiation of the lectin pathway? So we're talking about lectin, then lectin is saying we're seeing mannose on the bacteria, right? So that's our reference there. All right, is this, the pathway is initiated by the binding of antibodies? That's the classical pathway. The pathway is triggered by the presence of LPS. That's the alternative pathway. The pathway begins when mannose binding lectin, sounding familiar, binds to specific carbohydrates on the pathogen surface. That's exactly what's happening. The pathway starts when the complement complex binds to a pathogen surface directly without the need for prior antibody binding. Now, that is what is happening when complement acts, but is that specific to the lectin pathway? So we need to be specific that this is recognition of mannose by lectin. So C is our best answer here. In a clinical scenario, a patient with recurrent infections is found to have a deficiency in C1q, which is part of complement. They have a complement deficiency. Okay, and this is one that reacts to the antibody. So which pathway was that one? The classical one, right? All right, so which complement pathway, that's literally what it's going to ask. Which complement pathway is primarily affected by this? Not the lectin pathway, not the alternative pathway, the classical, specifically because now we can't recognize antibody. Your other pathways should still be fine. All right, I think this is our last one. This is the complement cascade, basically like the steps of it. We have initiation, amplification, polymerization, and the membrane attack. So initiation, we're going to activate the complement somehow by one of those 3 methods. Activate by classical, alternative, or lectin pathway. Then we have the amplification. Complement, which we do the C with this little mark here. Complement activates other downstream complement proteins. Whatever complement you just activated will activate downstream complements now. We're getting everybody pulled together. Polymerization. Activated complement. Start to act together. I don't feel like they do this all the time. It might be the flies, actually. That's a good point. And then we have the last one, which is the membrane attack complex, which is whenever we're going to build a hole in our target pathogen. Build hole in target. Okay. Question. Which step in the complement cascade involves the assembly of activated complement protein molecules to form a structure that creates pores in this pathogen's membrane? That process of building that before we're getting to that membrane attack complex. Once we've built it, the membrane attack complex will cause the cell to lyse and leak out. But that process of building it, the assembly of it, that's our polymerization step. So initiation was just the activation, the amplification, causing other complements to get activated, bringing them together to build something, assembling, that's the polymerization. Opsonization is something that complement can do, act as a molecular handle, but that's not part of that polymerization assembly step. A patient is diagnosed with a condition that impairs the formation of our membrane attack complex, the hole that we would build as a result of complement. This condition would most directly affect which step of the complement cascade. If you're impeding the ability to form the membrane attack complex, then you're impeding that polymerization step. So you can't build your membrane attack complex. So are we having a problem initiating complement activation? That's probably not it. Are we having a problem amplifying? That's also probably not it. It's probably C, polymerizing the complement components into that membrane attack complex, and clearing immune complexes isn't part of the issue here. That's a whole different aspect of how the immune system will function, which we'll get into more in chapter 17. All right, that is it. Do you have any questions? Okay, so if you guys are watching this later on, please email me if you have any questions. Otherwise, that's it for today. Thank you guys.